Hello friends. Tonight's story isn't about gunslingers or gold rushes. There are no dramatic duels in dusty streets, no swinging saloon doors or heroic outlaws. Instead, we're stepping into something quieter and heavier, the kind of history you don't see in sepia-toned postcards. But you might hear it in the hiss of wind through dry grass, or feel it in the crack of a frozen wash basin at dawn. So if you're ready to let go of the day, turn down the lights, maybe light a candle, let your breath slow, because tonight you're waking up somewhere cold, somewhere lonely, where the wooden floor creaks beneath your feet, and the only thing louder than the wind is your baby's coughing. Congratulations. You've just stepped into the worn shoes of a woman on the American frontier. Imagine yourself at 23 years old. The first pale light of dawn is barely touching the frost-rimmed glass of the cabin window. You wake not to an alarm clock, but to the slow ache of cold in your joints, and the sound of something scratching near the chicken coop. Your baby is beside you, bundled in thick quilts. She's warm for now, but her forehead felt hot last night. You reach over, your hand dry and cracked, and feel it again. Still warm, too warm. You sit up. The cabin groans around you. The logs in the stove burned down hours ago, and your breath forms little clouds in the still air. There's no one else to tend to things this morning. Your husband rode off 4 days ago to trade in town. A 2-day trip there if the weather holds. 3 if he hits snow. You ease your feet into rough wool socks, then into the stiff leather boots near the hearth. There's a rhythm to this now. A practiced, mechanical series of movements. You repeat every single morning. Feed the fire, boil the water, start the coffee if there's any left. Check the chickens, milk the goat. If the wind isn't too cruel, maybe hang out yesterday's laundry, frozen stiff like ghostly silhouettes of shirts and petticoats. You're tired, yes, but that's not unusual. This kind of tired doesn't come from lack of sleep, though that happens too. It's the kind that seeps into your bones from the weight of unending work. No one romanticized the frontier in your world. Not really. The newspapers back east wrote about opportunity, about wide skies and free land. But out here, freedom meant you did everything yourself, or it didn't get done. The day stretches ahead of you, not with choices, but with necessities. First the stove. It takes patience, coaxing. You crumble paper, stack kindling, then feed in a split log or two from the dwindling pile. It catches, finally. And soon, the cast iron kettle hums faintly, steam curling upward into the chill. Your hands move automatically, shifting, lifting, pouring. You grind what coffee remains, pouring the dark grains into a pot of boiling water, hoping it hasn't gone bitter with age. While it brews, you kneel by the cradle. The baby stirs but doesn't cry. She's warm but restless. You wipe her brow with a cloth soaked in willow bark tea. A homemade remedy, the only kind you have. The nearest doctor lives nearly 30 miles away, and there's no one to fetch him. You whisper a quiet prayer and tuck her in tighter. Outside, the light is brighter now, harsh and flat, reflecting off snow in every direction. You squint against it as you step out to the coop. The wolf tracks from yesterday are still there, pressed into the crust of ice just beyond the fence. The chickens cluck nervously. You throw feed, collect 3 eggs. One is cracked, but you'll still use it. You can't afford waste. Back inside, the room has warmed slightly. Your dress is simple, Wool, thick and serviceable, layered over under things that haven't been laundered in days. Water freezes in the wash basin, so bathing waits for warmer weather. You change the baby, mend a torn hem, then turn your attention to the bread. Yesterday, you boiled beans. Today, it's cornbread. You knead it with rough hands, mind-wandering, not to dreams, but to a dozen practical questions. Do we have enough salt? Did the goat eat yesterday? Will the roof hold if it snows again tonight? There's no time to pause. No time to feel sorry for yourself. And yet, in the quiet between chores, the silence settles deep in your chest. Out here you are wife, mother, nurse, cook, laborer, and sometimes even sheriff. If trouble comes to the door, a drunk drifter, a wild animal, a neighbor's cow that breaks through the fence, you are the one who answers. The hours drift on, slow but never still. You check the drying herbs above the hearth. Lavender, chamomile, slippery elm. Not luxuries, but tools for surviving illness and injury. Later, you step outside again, this time with an armful of wood to stack by the door. Your boots crunch over icy ruts, and you glance toward the tree line. It's quiet, too quiet. No birds today. You think again of that wolf, of the way the shadows move near dusk, and of the rifle inside, which you've loaded and cleaned more times than you can count. You were never taught to shoot properly, but you learned, the way you learned to stitch wounds, to wring a chicken's neck, to birth a child with no help but boiling water, a paring knife, and your own instinct. Childbirth out here isn't a sacred ritual. It's dangerous, often silent, sometimes fatal. No midwife, no ether, no clean linens or sterile tools. You've lost neighbors to it. You've buried more than one stillborn child in the frozen earth behind the house, marked only with a name carved in soft pine. You never speak of them aloud, but you remember. The evening comes quickly, a grey wash over the sky. You light a lantern, adjust the wick. Its glow throws long shadows on the walls. Walls lined with dried goods, canning jars, and the quilt you started piecing together last winter. The baby is fussing now. You hold her close, rocking slowly in a creaky chair, humming some old hymn from your girlhood. The words soft, familiar. Your dress still smells faintly of smoke and flour. Your feet ache, and you're still listening for hoofbeats that haven't come. You wonder again if your husband made it through the pass, if the snow held off, if he'll come back with sugar, or shoes for the baby, or news. You press your cheek to the baby's hair. The room is quiet except for the wind and the ticking of the mantel clock. You think of the women you knew back east, of parlours and books and music, of petticoats unsoiled by mud, of hands soft with idle time. But that life, it feels like fiction now. Out here, there is only the present, only the next fire to stoke, the next danger to fend off, the next prayer whispered into dark. Night falls without ceremony. The moon hangs low over the prairie, casting long, pale fingers across the frost-covered ground. Inside, the fire crackles low. You tuck more wood in carefully. Not too much. You'll need what's left for tomorrow. You eat alone tonight. A piece of bread, a spoon of beans. There's no sense in preparing more. Not when the baby's still sick. Not when the appetite barely flickers. Outside something rustles. A fox maybe, or something worse. You grip the lantern and check the door. It's barred. You whisper a few words. Not a full prayer, but close enough. words meant to hold fear at bay, to fill the room with something other than silence. Then you settle in for the night, curling beside the cradle, still dressed, just in case. The rifle is within reach. The walls creak with the wind. Snow begins to fall. It taps lightly on the roof, like fingertips on an old drum. And in that stillness you think, not of tomorrow, but of all the days that have come before. The women who crossed rivers in wagons, the ones who buried children and pressed on, the ones who never made it past the first frost, and the ones, like you, who did. You are not the hero of a Western novel. There is no reward at the end of your day, no badge, no fame, just survival, just the small victories. A dry roof, a fed child, a warm corner of firelight. This is not a story of conquest or glory. It is a story of endurance. And if you think you could have lasted even a week out here, you may want to think again. Because frontier women didn't get remembered for how strong they were. They got forgotten. And they kept going anyway. Imagine a woman stepping off a steamboat onto the cold, cracked soil of Montana Territory in the 1880s. Her boots are worn. Her coat is too thin for the season. But she stands upright, unbothered. A wide-brimmed hat shades her face, and her eyes, dark and patient, survey the small, rough town that sprawls ahead. Her name is Mary Fields, and she is, by every definition of her time, out of place. Mary is a tall black woman, born into slavery. In Tennessee, around 1832. By the time she arrives in Cascade, Montana, she is over 50 years old, widowed, freed, and very much alone. The war is long past. The South has changed its shape, but not its heart. Mary's past is not written down in detail, because few cared enough to write it. But what we do know is this. She worked as a laundress, a chambermaid, a servant in a convent school, and in all those roles, she built a reputation for being quick-witted, hard-working, and fiercely independent. But the city wore on her, and so she came west, not to find fortune, but perhaps to find something quieter, some corner of the world where she could simply be. She first arrived at the Ursuline Convent in Toledo, Ohio, a Catholic mission and school, where she worked in the kitchen and gardens. But after a conflict there, perhaps over her temper or her refusal to submit, she left. She followed the Ursuline nuns again, this time to their new mission in Montana, a place remote and rugged, where help was desperately needed, and rules were stretched thin by necessity. When Mary arrived at St. Peter's Mission near Cascade, she didn't ask permission. She simply started working. She hauled freight, split wood, chopped ice, dug trenches. Jobs that many men wouldn't do. Mary did without complaint, and in a place where survival depended on muscle and stubbornness. Mary was exactly the woman they needed. But this story doesn't begin in glory. It begins in mud and wind and the slow, unnoticed business of building something when no one expects you to. The days at St. Peter's Mission started early, before the frost had even begun to lift from the grass. Mary Fields rose before the sun. There were chickens to feed, water to haul, and sometimes livestock that had wandered off during the night. She handled it all, with thick gloves, a battered coat, and a quiet resolve. The nuns at the mission wore habits. Mary wore overalls. She carried tools in a leather belt and wasn't afraid to use them. She smoked cigars, spoke her mind, and cursed like a stevedore when the situation called for it, which it often did. But beneath that rough surface was someone who kept the place running. Mary delivered food to nearby settlements. She fixed fences, tended the garden, and built relationships with local traders and native tribes alike. She didn't preach, she provided. It's worth remembering too, Mary was not young. She was already in her 50s when she took on this labor. Her back ached, her hands were calloused, but she worked harder than most men a decade younger. She didn't ask for thanks, but people noticed. The children at the mission adored her. They called her Black Mary with affection and ran to her when they were cold or hungry or scared. She made toys for them out of scraps, braided their hair, told stories while peeling potatoes by the stove. There's a kind of heroism that doesn't make it into textbooks. It doesn't wear medals or stand on podiums. It gets up early, works late, and makes sure others survive the night. Mary's heroism was that kind, unrecorded, except in the quiet way a roof didn't leak, or a trail was cleared, or a small hand found a warm biscuit in the morning. But of course, the frontier had a way of testing everyone, even Mary Fields, and her tests would come not from nature, but from people. Word began to spread in nearby Cascade. A tall black woman, living among nuns, doing men's work, wearing men's clothes, carrying a revolver. It didn't sit right with some of the town's menfolk, especially those who felt their authority should stretch further than their actual reach. They started whispering, and one day, trouble came calling. The stories differ. One version says it started with a dispute over hired labor. Another says a male worker resented taking orders from Mary. What is certain is that an argument broke out, escalated, and shots were fired. No one was killed, but the incident sent shockwaves through the mission. The bishop was called, and though the nuns defended her, he made his decision quickly. Mary Fields, he declared, was no longer welcome at St. Peter's. Too much commotion, too much independence, too much Mary. It could have ended there, and for many women, it would have. But Mary didn't leave in disgrace. She left with her head high, and with something better than a reputation, respect. The nuns gave her a wagon. The townspeople took up a collection. And Mary Fields, well into her 50s, set out to build a life entirely her own. She opened a laundry business in Cascade, delivered mail, did hauling jobs for ranches, and eventually won a contract with the United States Postal Service. She became the first black woman to carry mail in Montana, possibly in the entire country. They called her Stagecoach Mary, not as a joke, but with admiration. Because when the snow got too deep for horses, she walked. When the roads washed out, she found a new path. And no one ever dared steal her cargo. They say Mary never missed a delivery. Through snow, sleet, and prairie wind, she rode her route with a rifle under the seat, and a flask of whiskey tucked into her coat. Not for drinking, but for rubbing the joints when the cold cut deep. Her horses knew her voice. So did the wolves. She wasn't fast, she wasn't young, but she was reliable. The townspeople came to rely on her for more than just mail. She delivered medicine news from the east, letters from sons long gone, and with every arrival, a little hope. It was said she could repair a broken wheel. In the time it took a man to tie a scarf, she patched her own harness, reshod horses in snow, and never complained. Children waved when they saw her wagon coming over the ridge. She often tossed them sweets, or scraps of cloth their mothers could use for mending. But for all her work, Mary never owned a home of her own. She stayed in the livery stable some nights, or above the saloon when it was cold. Locals offered her meals, but she insisted on paying her way. She did laundry for the schoolhouse, hauled freight for the general store, cleared snow from the mission steps every Sunday, long after the bishop had sent her away. Cascade was a hard place, but Mary made it a little softer, and gradually she became not just part of the town, but the soul of it. No one dared challenge her, not seriously. One local tried to bar her from a saloon. She challenged him to a fistfight. He declined. Another tried to cheat her on a delivery fee. She hitched his wagon to a post and left it there until he paid her properly. People respected Mary, not because she demanded it, but because she'd earned it. Every splintered wheel, every snow-choked path, every letter delivered. It all built a quiet legacy that no newspaper ever bothered to write. But it was there, etched in the memory of those who called her neighbor. By the 1890s, Cascade had grown. There were more buildings now, a proper post office, even a church with a bell that rang on Sundays. And still, Mary Fields rode her route, through sleet and slush, with her mailbag strapped tight, and her eyes scanning the horizon for anything that didn't belong. Some said she was too old. Others said she was too loud, too stubborn, too masculine. Mary didn't argue. She just kept working. The townsfolk loved to tell stories about her, how she once faced down a bear on the trail, stood her ground, rifle in hand, until the creature turned away. How she never backed down from a poker game, but always paid her debts in full. How she wore men's boots because they lasted longer, and kept a garden of herbs behind the livery stable because she liked the smell of mint at dusk. But for all her boldness, Mary never asked for attention. She didn't campaign, didn't protest. She simply lived, as fully and as freely as the land allowed, in a world that had tried to confine her. Through slavery, through gender, through race. She carved out a space where she could be unbothered, unapologetic, free. She never married again. She never had children of her own. But she mothered a town, fed its workers, healed its sick, delivered its hope. And when newcomers asked about her, they were told simply, "That's Mary. Don't cross her, and don't forget to tip her well." In that silence between wagon wheels on gravel, in the warmth of a letter delivered during winter, in the rough palms that stitched up a split harness in the dark, that's where Mary's legacy lived. Not in grand speeches, but in small, enduring acts of survival. There's something curious about how people talked about Mary Fields during her lifetime. To some, she was a curiosity, a spectacle. A colored woman with a gun, they whispered. Part marvel, part myth. To others, she was a pillar, a fixture so woven into the daily fabric that they couldn't imagine Cascade without her. And to a few, she was a challenge to everything they thought they knew about who should hold power and who should stay silent. But Mary didn't waste time correcting anyone. She let them talk, let them speculate. She focused on the road, the horses, the mail. She focused on what mattered. There are photographs of her, faded and formal. She wears a plain dress, her face stern. Not unkind, but not one to invite foolishness. There's a cigar in her mouth in some versions, a detail that makes her seem almost rebellious. But really, it was just Mary, unbothered by convention, too busy with the day's work to worry about appearances. When she was finally honored, It wasn't by politicians or wealthy townsfolk. It was by the children she'd once fed, by the young women she'd hired to help her with deliveries, by the neighbors who remembered how she'd shown up during a snowstorm with coal or bread or a kind word. She was known for her strength, yes, but also for her fairness, her sense of justice, her willingness to help, even when she had little to spare. One saloon kept a seat open for her every night. No one else dared sit in it, not because of fear, but because of respect. It wasn't about power, it was about presence. And Mary's presence filled a room, the way a mountain fills a horizon, quietly, immovably. As the years wore on, the frontier began to change. Railroads spread like veins across the land. New settlers came with trunks full of china, factory-made goods, and ideas about civilized life. That left little room for women like Mary. Cascade itself began to soften. There were now hotels, dress shops, and more rules. And though Mary continued to work well into her 70s, the world was slowly passing her by. She stepped back from her postal route. Her knees ached. The cold settled deeper in her joints. And yet, she never fully stopped. She still ran errands for neighbors, still grew herbs and vegetables behind the saloon, still smoked cigars on the porch, and told stories to anyone who asked kindly. She never owned property, never had savings. When she fell ill, the town passed a hat. They made sure she had a warm place to sleep, that she was fed, that she knew. Even if the government had never acknowledged her, Cascade had not forgotten. When Mary Fields passed away in 1914, the town held one of its largest funerals to date. Children who had grown up watching her ride by came to pay respects. So did barkeeps, ranchers, teachers, and sisters from the mission. She was buried in Cascade in a modest grave. No great monument, just a name, and the quiet understanding that without her, the town might never have stood as it did. In the years since, her story has resurfaced now and then. In local histories, in ballads, in the fading memory of descendants who still remember the smell of her pipe smoke and the sound of her boots on packed snow. Mary Fields left no writings, no journal entries, no published memoirs, just a few photographs, a worn trail of recollections, and the occasional newspaper clipping. That treated her more like folklore than flesh and blood. But sometimes, legacy isn't measured by what you write down. It's measured by what people remember when the fire burns low and the stories begin to stir. Ask an old-timer in Cascade about Stagecoach Mary, and they might still say, she never missed a delivery. She'd ride through hell and hailstones to bring a letter. Or she drank whiskey, carried a rifle, but she braided my grandmother's hair when she was sick. Or even, she was tough, but kind. Didn't matter who you were. If you were decent, she'd help you. That's the real legacy. Not the legends, but the lived moments. The time she stopped to patch a child's shoes. The night she broke up a fight in the saloon. With nothing but her glare. The way she kept delivering mail, long after her knees should have made it impossible. Mary Fields didn't build a town with blueprints or banknotes. She built it with work, with presence, with a kind of steadiness. That turns chaos into community. She was not the face of the frontier in her time. Not in paintings or plays or public celebrations. But she was the frontier in all its contradictions. Hard and giving, silent and loud. Forgotten by the nation, but unforgettable to those who shared her road. When we think of the Wild West, our minds often drift to the familiar myths. The lone cowboy silhouetted at sunset, the gunfight at high noon, the saloon girl with a wink, and the sheriff with a badge. But somewhere outside those frames, past the edge of the town, down a trail iced over in silence, there rode a woman named Mary Fields, and her story, though quieter, is no less essential. She didn't conquer the frontier. She endured it. She didn't tame the land. She adapted to it, made peace with its harsh rhythms, matched its stubbornness with her own. And she showed, without grand gestures. That strength doesn't always arrive with a gun drawn. Sometimes it arrives in a wool coat, boots too old, and hands weathered by rope and rain. She showed that a black woman, freed from bondage, barred from comfort, and born into a world that refused her name, could still make a place her own, still change a town, still matter. Mary Fields didn't just carry the mail. She carried weight, carried expectation, carried the long silence between what was said about women like her and what they actually were. And so, tonight, as you settle into your blankets, know that somewhere in the worn corners of American history, there's a trail still etched with wagon wheels and boot prints, a trail she rode for decades. One that led not to fame or fortune, but to a quiet kind of greatness. The kind that's easy to overlook, but impossible to forget. If you were to walk into a long abandoned homestead, somewhere along a forgotten stretch of prairie, you might think you'd found nothing of value. A collapsed roof, peeling wallpaper, floorboards worn thin by the memory of footsteps. But look a little closer, sometimes hidden behind a false panel in a dresser, beneath the lining of a trunk, or tucked inside the hollow of a Bible's binding. You'll find something else. A folded scrap of paper, faded handwriting, the quiet voice of someone long gone, whispering across 100 years. The frontier was hard on women, but it didn't erase them. They left traces, small, deliberate marks that told their stories, in the only ways they could. Diaries, letters never sent, quilt squares embroidered with symbols only they understood. Many of these writings were never meant to be seen. They were confessions, prayers, outlets for grief too dangerous or too heavy to share aloud. A woman might write by candlelight after her children were asleep. One line a night, her pen made from a whittled quill, her ink thinned with melted snow. The pages were not filled with tales of conquest, but with careful observations. March 4th, the baby's cough is worse. Boiled sage with honey, no change. 3 eggs today, wind from the north. Or, Sarah cried at the hymn today. I didn't ask why, we just sang softer. There is something sacred in these entries, not in what they say, but in the fact that they exist at all. Out here, where loneliness pressed in like the cold, where grief had to be swallowed with the morning tea, writing was resistance. It was a way to remember, to feel, to survive the silence. Not all frontier women could read or write, but many could. And those who couldn't still found ways to mark the passage of time. A cross-stitched sampler, a series of notches on a beam, a single embroidered name hidden in the corner of a blanket. But for those who could write, paper was precious, ink rarer still. So they wrote in the margins of things, in family Bibles, thick, leather-bound tomes that travelled west, wrapped in cloth and carried over mountains. These weren't just religious texts. They were scrapbooks, journals, repositories of the sacred and the ordinary. One woman wrote, just below the verse in Ecclesiastes, "I felt the baby move today, like a bubble. I wonder if he will survive." Another, beneath the line from Psalms, "The hens are laying again. I think spring is finally near." These small insertions didn't challenge the scripture. They lived beside it, wove their own quiet theology into the sacred text. Faith wasn't abstract out here. It wasn't cloistered in cathedral walls. It was stitched into everyday survival. You prayed over rising bread. You murmured blessings while cutting your child's hair. You whispered forgiveness while sewing the clothes your husband would wear to bury your daughter. These Bible notes often served multiple roles. A ledger of births and deaths, a place to record the first frost, a line or two of a hymn that no one else remembered, and sometimes, folded and pressed between the pages, were letters. Unsent, perhaps, unsendable. Letters to mothers far away, to sisters buried back east, to husbands who would never return. "My dearest Emma," one begins, "the baby is gone. I buried her in the orchard, by the one apple tree that still tries. I held her until the breath left her, and then a little longer still." That letter was never mailed, but it was found. A century later, still folded between the pages of Revelation. A different kind of apocalypse. A different kind of salvation. If writing was scarce, women turned to other languages. Languages of thread, pattern, and color. Quilting was not just craft. It was communication. Each square could tell a story. A particular stitch might represent a birth, a certain shade of blue, a death, a repeating pattern, perhaps the passage of a family from one homestead to another. Some women used quilting to map emotion, to mark time, to speak what they could not say aloud. A quilt hung on a line could be more than drying fabric. In some communities, it signaled need, or mourning, or welcome. When women gathered to sew, they weren't just making blankets. They were weaving a kind of shared record, a communal history. In church basements, around cook stoves, on porches when the air was warm. Hands moved, needles flicked, and stories were passed from mouth to mouth, thread to thread. And when hardship came, as it often did, a finished quilt was passed along to the new widow, to the mother of a stillborn child, to the girl leaving home for marriage, into a life she had not chosen. These were not grand gestures, but they were powerful, because frontier women didn't have statues built for them. Their names weren't carved into granite, but their lives were stitched into cloth. That wrapped their children through winter nights, and rested on their knees as they died. Even now, these quilts survive. Faded, frayed, but still whole. In museums, in attic trunks, in homes where the owners no longer know the stories behind the squares, but the women who made them knew. And that's enough. Out on the frontier, the church was more than a place of worship. It was a lifeline. And for women, it offered something even more valuable than salvation: company. On Sundays, they gathered, not just to pray, but to breathe the same warm air, to trade news, to remember what it felt like to be seen. After services, they stayed behind, organized sewing circles, shared bread recipes, exchanged bits of cloth or herbs or soap. It was in these quiet gatherings that the invisible network of women took shape. Letters were passed, notes about which family had lost a child, which neighbor had run out of flour, which girl needed looking after while her mother healed from birth. In a world that often left women isolated, the church gave them a place to conspire. against the silence. Sometimes these spaces became political, not loudly, not with speeches or pamphlets, but with whispered plans for a school, a petition for a road, a basket left on the doorstep of the woman whose husband drank too much, through hymn books and canned peaches, through funeral shawls and baptismal gowns. They built a quiet infrastructure of care, and when one of them fell, through grief or illness or sheer exhaustion, the others lifted her, with stew, with stitches, with the brief life-saving words, "You are not alone." There's no record of these ministries, no archive cataloguing the comfort offered, in dimly lit chapels or cluttered kitchens. But they were real, and for many women, they were the difference between despair and endurance. The sewing circle was not just domestic work, it was survival work. And sometimes, revolution threaded one seam at a time. There are griefs too quiet for the ledger, too sharp for the hymn book, too common to be considered tragedy, and yet too heavy to carry alone. Stillbirth, miscarriage, children lost to fever, to winter, to water that came from the well a little too murky one morning. These were not events to be shared widely. They weren't always even named. A woman might wrap the tiny body in a shawl. She'd stitched for a cradle and bury it with no ceremony, except the turning of earth, and a whispered name. Neighbors would bring stew, bread, a silence that didn't need to be explained. Sometimes a small cross appeared near the orchard, sometimes not even that, because grief, on the frontier, had to make room for tomorrow's chores. And so it folded itself into everyday things. A button from the child's dress sewn into a pocket, a lock of hair braided into a quilt square, a lullaby sung to an empty cradle. Just once before the song was put away for good, one letter found hidden in the lining of a sewing basket read simply, "Third lost, body strong but heart tired, still must carry water." That was the rhythm. Grieve briefly, then continue, not because they didn't feel it, but because the world around them offered no space to stop. So the pain became part of the fabric, woven into bread dough, wiped into apron hems, sewn beneath quilts passed to daughters who would never know the full story. This wasn't weakness, it was survival, the quiet kind, the kind that never makes the history books, but shaped the world all the same. Not every letter hidden away was a cry of grief. Some were full of longing, affection, romance too tender or too dangerous to be spoken aloud. On the frontier, love often came quietly. A look exchanged at the general store, a note passed through a trusted friend, a name sewn into the hem of a dress. Sometimes the letters were addressed, often they weren't. To the man with kind eyes and cracked hands, "I see you gathering wood when the weather turns. I see how you tuck your boy's scarf tighter before the bell rings. If I had more courage, I would say this aloud, but instead I've baked an extra loaf. It's on your step." Some were not meant for anyone living. "My dearest husband," a widow once wrote, "you've been gone 5 years now, but I still wake thinking I hear your boots. I keep your coat near the stove. I wear your scarf when it storms. The neighbors think I've recovered. I have not, but I keep the fire going. You'd have liked how I fixed the fence." These notes, folded, tucked, saved, were never dramatic, but they were real. They spoke of the ache for connection, in a world where the days stretched long and lonely, where marriages were sometimes arranged, sometimes rushed, and not always kind, where a single good conversation could echo for months. In a mind starved for companionship, love didn't look like novels. It looked like mittens mended, like boots cleaned and set near the door, like a letter written with trembling hands, and tucked between proverbs and psalms, and sometimes like never saying it at all, but hoping the person knew anyway. When historians open a homestead chest or lift the lid of a rusted trunk, they don't always find grand documents. Often they find fragments: a child's hair ribbon, a dried sprig of lavender wrapped in cloth, a page torn from a ledger with measurements scribbled in the margins. These are not artifacts that make headlines, but they are the remnants of real lives. Some women stitched initials into dish towels, not to claim them, but to leave a mark in a world that rarely carved their names in stone. Others tucked recipes into Bible covers, not just lists of ingredients, but memories disguised as instructions. Add flour until the dough feels like baby's cheek. Stir clockwise or the jam won't set. These weren't just ways of cooking. They were codes, passed down through generations, holding memories of places, people, moments too fleeting to catch on paper. In one abandoned cabin, a researcher found a child's shoe, wrapped in lace and hidden behind a chimney stone. A keepsake, a talisman, maybe a memorial. In another, a wooden spoon, carved with notches. Perhaps for each winter survived, perhaps for each child born. These quiet mementos tell us what the record books do not. They tell us how it felt to live then, what mattered enough to save, what couldn't be spoken, but also couldn't be thrown away. The past doesn't always survive in bold letters. Sometimes it endures in soft cotton, in brittle pages, in the curve of handwriting left behind by a hand now dust. And when we touch these things, we are not just holding objects. We are touching memory, love, fear, hope, all the invisible things that once filled a small creaking cabin, somewhere on the edge of the known world. There is a particular kind of silence that lived in frontier homes. It wasn't always peaceful. Often it was thick, like the hush that comes after a storm, or the stillness before bad news. In that silence, women listened to the wind and the sound of their own breath, to the tick of a clock, the crackle of a fire, the slow rustle of a page being turned in private. Some recorded nothing, not because they had no thoughts, but because even paper felt too fragile to contain what they carried. For them, the silence itself became memory. They remembered not by writing, but by repeating actions. Stirring soup the way their mother had. Folding linens into thirds, the way she had once taught. Lighting candles at dusk, even when the night no longer frightened them. In time, the silences passed on too. A daughter learned not to ask. A granddaughter grew up sensing there were stories, but never quite hearing them. Still, the feeling lingered. In the scent of cedar from an old chest, in the faint scratch of thread pulled through fabric, in the peculiar weight of a Bible. That seemed to hold more than scripture. These women didn't always leave words, but they left presence. In rooms now gone, in gestures remembered without explanation, in the way a certain lullaby feels sad, even if no one knows why. The frontier is often remembered in noise dash, the boom of rifles, the thunder of hooves, the clamor of men claiming land. But beneath all that, there was the other frontier, the one carved in silence, in softness, in waiting. And in that stillness, women left their mark, delicate, invisible, enduring. Today, many of the names are gone. The cabins rotted back into the earth, the quilts folded in museum drawers, the letters yellowed and crumbling. In archival boxes few will ever open. But still, something remains. Not just the artifacts, but the act of remembering, of knowing that somewhere a woman once sat by firelight, with sore hands and a heavy heart, and wrote the words no one else would speak. I am still here. The child smiled today. The snow did not come. He did not return. These were not the declarations of history makers. These were the quiet records of survival, of holding on to hope, in a world that rarely offered any, of making beauty from scraps, of singing over sleeping children, even when your voice trembled. It's easy to forget these women. They asked for nothing, expected nothing. Their griefs were private, their joys modest, but they are still here, in every button saved, every stitch passed down, every recipe that calls for a pinch, not a measurement. They are in the silence between sentences, in the softness of worn linen, in the weight of the past when held gently. And if you ever come across a Bible, bulging slightly at the seams, look inside. You might find a letter, you might find a life. Not every woman on the frontier woke to fetch wood, or boil beans over an open hearth. Some woke to the sound of a servant lighting the stove. Downstairs, in a well-plastered kitchen, beneath ceilings trimmed with tin, and velvet curtains that had crossed an ocean. Imagine, for a moment, a mansion on the edge of nowhere, built with rail money, or cattle, or the fast fortune of oil bubbling up, where once there was nothing. The woman who lives here wears lace. Her corsets are tight, her shoes narrow, her gloves imported from Paris. She receives guests in a drawing room, with crystal sconces, and a piano she rarely touches. But don't be fooled by the elegance, because here too is a kind of loneliness. There is no city beyond the garden hedge, no theatre down the road, no circle of peers who understand. The etiquette of teaspoons and mourning veils. Her husband is often away, on business, or somewhere quieter, where fortunes are easier to enjoy. And so she walks the wide halls of a house meant to impress, listening to the echo of her own footsteps. The parlor becomes her stage. She reads. She writes long letters. She hosts salons, sometimes, where other well-dressed women discuss books. Between glances at the clock, they're waiting too, for news, for husbands, for a chance to matter. There's no dust here, not visibly, but it's in the corners of things, in the silence between dinner and bed, in the pressed linens folded by hands not her own. This too was the frontier, not just the wildness of land, but the slow erosion of meaning. Behind brocade wallpaper, in these houses of quiet grandeur, refinement became its own form of labor. The woman of the house had duties, not to tend crops, but to maintain appearances. She hosted luncheons, planned church fundraisers, supervised the servants who scrubbed and ironed, and whispered in languages not taught in finishing school. She was expected to master piano pieces no one else would hear, to embroider napkins that would be folded and forgotten. Her tools were not axes or churns, but etiquette books, china patterns, seasonal menus copied from newspapers back east. Sometimes she read poetry aloud in the parlor, while guests nodded politely. Sometimes she arranged flowers, matching them to the season and to her mood. But behind all this polish was something quieter, a slow creeping realization that wealth did not shield her from isolation. She might look across the table at dinner and see a man she barely knew anymore, his face lined from deals made far away. She might hear the laughter of the housemaid's children and feel a pang she couldn't name. Her corset pinched, her rings left dents in her fingers, her shoes blistered, but she smiled through it all, because to be ungraceful was to be ungrateful. So she performed. She danced at charity balls, beneath chandeliers imported from New York, in a dress sewn by another woman's hands. She read novels where heroines made choices. She sometimes wrote letters she didn't send, and on some nights, when the piano was closed and the last lamp had been turned down, she stood before the mirror and asked herself, softly, what life might have been without all the lace, not far from these fine homes, sometimes just over the rise of a hill. Other women labored barefoot in the fields, their skirts patched with old feed sacks, their hands rough with lye and sun. And these women, though rarely invited into the parlors, held the frontier together just the same. Black women, indigenous women, immigrant women from Sweden, Germany, Mexico, all lived within sight of silk and silver. But worlds apart from it, the wealthy women sent their linens to be washed. By the same hands that hauled water in winter, they sipped tea poured by young girls who could not afford to sit down. There were spoken rules and unspoken walls. Still, the edges sometimes blurred. An indigenous nurse might cradle a banker's child with more tenderness than the mother dared show. A laundress might share a recipe. That became a signature dish at a Sunday luncheon. And sometimes, one of the elite women would break form, would visit a school for the poor, would ask questions not usually asked, would write under a false name about women's rights or the price of wheat. There were suffragettes in prairie skirts and abolitionists in satin gloves. Not many, but enough. Enough to make change a whisper, soft as lace, steady as the wind on an open plain. For all the differences in wealth, every woman on the frontier stood at the edge of something unknown. For some it was childbirth, for others it was expectation, and for many it was the long, slow reckoning of what their lives had become, so far from the cities that shaped their mothers. In the parlor, she practiced smiles, but in her journal, she wrote questions. Is this my life? Do I love him, or only the quiet between us? What would they say if I left? Would they even follow? She never did leave, of course. The frontier, in all its forms, required endurance more than escape. And so she stayed, hosted, planned, nodded, aged. But she watched, listened, noted, and now and then she gave money where it was needed, paid for a teacher's new coat, funded a nurse's training, published a poem in a distant magazine, signed only a lady of the plains. Not every frontier woman wore boots. Some wore brocade and bore silence just as heavily. But in their own way, they endured too. Behind the velvet drapes, between the teacups, in the hush of the parlor, after the guests had gone home. So now you know. The Wild West wasn't just horses and gun smoke. It was frostbitten fingers on a wooden cradle. It was bread dough beneath cracked nails. It was letters folded into the spine of a Bible, and corsets tightened against the weight of silence. It was women, enduring endlessly. Across sod houses and painted parlors, they stitched their presence into the land, without asking to be remembered. But tonight you did. You walked in their shoes, mud-caked or velvet-trimmed, and listened for the sound of their stories between the gusts of prairie wind. As you drift off now, know that somewhere beneath layers of dust and time, their voices are still echoing, soft as a lullaby, steady as a wagon wheel, waiting to be heard again.